normally when I'm asked to name an artist or work that has inspired me, I'm actually most likely to list something like the painted mural of the Villa Livia in Italy, or Hiroshige's 53 Stages of the Tokaido. Those are artists, not photographers, but artists who really inspired me. But of course, this is extra content for the real photo show after all. So I decided to keep things simple and admit to what is true, which is the influence of Atget on my work. And ever since I first saw his work, I've been a huge fan of his. Eugene Atget, we're seeing his work here. He was a French photographer who lived from 1857 to 1927. He's most famous for his extensive documentation of Old Paris, meaning the part of the city's fabric, medieval fabric, that was not destroyed by the renovations of the 19th century by Baron Haussmann. But I have always particularly loved Atget's photographs of parks. And whether he was photographing Versailles or the park at Luxembourg, Saint-Cloud, Parc de Sceaux, they're all amazing images that have had a huge influence on me and, of course, on my project Traces of Time. This photograph is titled Versailles 1905, and it in particular taught me how just really small, subtle details in a subject can really transform its meaning. On the surface, this image really monumentalizes its subject, right? We're looking at this garden urn from a low vantage point. The light is really quite dramatic with the dark trees in the background. It's almost like we're looking at the high altar of a church. But if you look at it more closely, there are these, yes, I'll say it, there are these little traces of time that undermine, right, the monumentality. You'll notice the little cracks or big cracks in the masonry. There's the mold or the lichen, which is growing on the steps, the unswept ground in the foreground. And, you know, there's that funny little dark stain at the base of the pedestal, which I'd have to do some research. Did people walk dogs in the park in 1905? I sort of think they did in France, and that looks a little bit like dog urine to me. So on the surface, there's a lot of surface differences between Atget's work and mine. He worked in black and white. I work in color. He used film and large format camera. I use digital photography and a handheld camera. He prefers wide angle views, like you can see here. I tend to prefer more narrow lenses, which is actually pretty unusual for a landscape photographer. And even when it comes to the parks, he really focused on the built elements, the masonry, in this case, the garden urn, the statues, and the trees, the foliage, not in every case, but generally, like in this one, they're really going dark. And they just form a dark backdrop. For me, however, I work really, really hard to give the vegetation a strong, articulate voice of its own. I'm moving now to one of my pictures, which I think is very evidently influenced by Atget. And what he taught me, however, is this fascination with the potential of the park as a photographic subject, as well as a way of seeing these details and of noticing the hand of time on a subject. In this work, you'll see this work is titled Sequence Number 8, and it's the last sequence in my book, Traces of Time. It shows the stone barrier and balustrade that encloses part of the park. And I think it's pretty evident that I've really adopted part of Atget's way of noticing details. The photo on the left, we're starting from the left, you see my cursor, you see the traces of muddy sand that's been kicked up by hard rain on the gate. In the next photo, you see a can and fallen leaves. Someone's put a can on this part of the concrete balustrade. In the middle photograph, it's that same exact part of the balustrade, but here someone's cleaned up the can, and you have all the dark marks and gloomy weather of a rainy day in this case. And then in the fourth photograph of the left, you have this huge branch that fell during a heavy rain. That the August and September I was there photographing the park, there were a lot of rainy days actually. And then in this last photograph, it's that same area, but I managed to catch it when the gardeners, it was a few weeks later, it took them a few weeks to do it actually, but when the gardeners are cutting this big branch apart and carting it away, cleaning up the sidewalk. So I'd like to add at the end, walking artists, which I identify myself as a walking artist, we have a curious habit of going back into the history of art and literature and posthumously anointing certain predecessors of ours as walking artists. And Ache is, of course, on my personal list of walking artists who never actually called themselves walking artists. Thank you very much.